So it's like we're going to have a really intimate discussion, which would be nice. So my name is Rebecca. I work at the OECD in the Policy Advice and Implementation Division, working on transitions and access to education. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Lena and Anabela. So I'll introduce both of our panelists. So Lena is an independent assessment researcher, honorary Norm Fellow at the Department of Education, University of Oxford, and a Fellow of the Association for Educational Assessment Europe. Her research interests include examination standards and assessment of transversal and higher order skills, such as creative thinking skills. I'm also joined today by Anabela, a member of the Board of Directors of the Educational Assessment from the Educational Assessment Institute from the Ministry of Education in Portugal. So Anabela is responsible for coordinating all international student assessments in which Portugal participates, such as PISA, TIMSS, CILS, and GIRLS. Anabela is also a member of the PISA Analysis and Dissemination Group and of the Questionnaire Group Development for TIMSS and GIRLS. So thank you very much to both our panelists for joining us today for this session on creativity in high-stakes assessment. So I wanted to start before we turn to our panelists with the first question to talk a wee bit about and to situate the panel that we're having today and what we mean by high-stakes assessment. Because over the course of the summit, we've talked about assessment in a lot of different shapes and forms, from the kind of formative assessment that we hope to see in the classroom on a day-to-day basis, from international assessments like PISA, which Andreas presented about, and Seven presented about, which have often a system monitoring role in education systems to monitor the progress of education and the system as a whole. But often when we're talking about high-stakes assessment, we're really focusing on what it is that students get out of the education system and what value it brings to them, more than just the learning that they get, which is obviously the most important thing that underpins it all, but often acting as a passport for their entry into the wider world beyond school itself. And often these assessments take the form of a qualification or a certificate or some kind of a bit of paper that they leave the education system with or progress to another stage within education. And these are things which in society there's a real strong importance that these are fair, that they're credible, that they're relevant, and that young people can use these assessments in some way or another to benefit themselves as they progress into the world. And that's really important. However, what we tend to hear is that when it comes to high-stakes assessment and creativity, high-stakes assessment tends to get a bit of a bad rap. And I think you probably, I feel the mood over the summit over the last couple of days that we feel it can be quite hard to have meaningful high-stakes assessments which meaningfully assess and create opportunities for creativity to occur. So I think often when we're talking about high-stakes assessment, we think first and foremost of exams. And so it'll be really interesting to hear from our panelists today, whether it is just about exams or whether there's more on the horizon that we can be talking about. And I think we all saw before when Andreas was presenting his slides the quite damning statistic that young people at 15 tend to have less creative thinking skills than young people at about age 10, which I think speaks some truth to the idea that maybe as we get to these higher levels of education, it can be harder to find places within the curriculum, within the learning environment for creativity to foster and to thrive. But does this have to be the case? And hopefully we can ask some questions about this in our session today. Hopefully we can dispel some myths, encourage some debate, and give some food for thought for people. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn to you first, Lena, and then we'll go to Anabela and ask you a bit about your current work, how it connects to the theme of creativity, and what it is you're working on at the moment that might have some connection to creativity and high-stakes assessment.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you everybody for coming along. We have already heard several messages from several speakers that say, high stakes summative assessment, especially in senior school, is the bogeyman. It's the crusher of creativity. And I'm used to being that monster in the room or the wicked stepmother who I'm here to talk about that. I spent most of my full-time working career working for large national exam boards in the United Kingdom, in Scotland and in England, and was dealing with all of that there. now working as an independent researcher. I'm mainly working on international projects and for international organisations and in countries around the world and in different regions around the world. Whether I'm looking at general education or vocational education, which a lot of my work is, or I'm maybe engaging directly with employers and what they see as their skills needs. It doesn't matter where I go and who I'm speaking to, the idea of creativity and creative thinking as something that is absolutely essential for the modern world, that our young people need to be equipped with for life, for work, just keeps coming back. And systems whose education system and the values and culture of their education systems are very different and have a different starting point are all wrestling with that question of how do we shift both the teaching and learning and the assessment in our systems to take account of the fact that some of these broad transversal skills that might loosely be called 21st century skills, but in which creativity or creative thinking seems to be a recurrent theme. How do we make that shift to make sure that we are developing those skills and assessing them fairly? I'm just hearing it in every project that I'm involved with in every part of the world.
Thanks, Lena. So you're hearing it in every part of the world. Let's turn to Portugal. Are you hearing some of the things there, and what relation does this have to your work in Portugal?
So the work that I do is very close to the development of PISA. So I was very engaged on the PISA creativity in different levels because it was a new innovative domain. There was integrated in Portugal wanted to participate because at that time we had just the guiding documents reviewed and the profile that states at the end of the compulsory education that we need to focus on content knowledge, but also in the 21st century skills and the values. So it's like very new, and for Portugal, it was very innovative document because teachers were able to have this document that state what we should do in school for those teachers that when they end the compulsory education by the age of 18 should have learned in schools and which tools they should have. So suddenly, creativity thinking comes from PISA, and then all of a sudden, all the teachers in Portugal were very surprised because we had good results, especially in areas they were not kind of relate immediately because they were like the areas of social problem solving or scientific problems and not the arts that everyone says that's an arts thing. That's for people that are artists. That's for people that are very creative. Like the conversation that we starting in this conference about this is a thing about the personality of the people is not something that you can raise and foster and grow along with other knowledge. And then suddenly we decided to do a lot of lectures. So we wanted a lot of things for teachers, presenting and discussing the content, give them not the focus on the results, but the focus of what PISA was assessing. And typically the discussion in our country and in our office is, if you don't include that in your assessments, how come you want us to teach it? So we already have heard that for several people here. And I remember that me, myself, and also the president of the board, many times said, but it's possible to assess. There is a proof, it's a period, so it means that you can be systematic and you can be very specific about the criteria and how to code it, how to say what is the creativity of it, and present very, very interesting and good tasks for students that engage them on doing that. So the point that we have now in Portugal is it's kind of a separation between lower stakes and high stakes assessments. if you have a discussion internally, people will say, we will be able to do this in the lower assessments, low stakes, because they have no impact, have more freedom, they can be more creative. But I'm sure we want to do this for give a grade to students that will use it to enter university. So I would say the work that I've done is very close to the teachers in order to have these discussions and raise their points. And actually, I would say that lots of teachers have struggled to do it in classrooms and provide space for those creativity and students.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think it speaks to something that we often hear that there's maybe more room to innovate in these lower levels of education or in the classroom. But when it comes to high stakes, assessment or exams or entrance to higher education, there's a lot of uncertainty in countries about messing with a system that has maybe existed for many, many years. And so I want to talk now about exams and what some of the challenges are with integrating, embedding creativity and opportunities for students to demonstrate creativity in exams as a format. And maybe that's something that you could talk about, what are the challenges you see with integrating creativity into exams, but what are ways that this can be overcome as well?
Thanks, Rebecca. That's a key question, of course. I think there are two main challenges, and we've alluded to both of them. We've heard a bit over the past couple of days about how we define creativity and the need to define creativity, and obviously there are definitions out there, and some of us are working with one every day, but maybe not quite the same, and we might even want to argue with somebody else's definition. And obviously, OECD has one set of definitions, and the fact that for PISA it's a slightly different set of definitions to this, so even within OECD there are two different versions. But if you are in a state or a country where we are trying to design a high stakes assessment for the young people who will leave school, for whom that assessment will have both psychological and practical and economic impact on them, then one driving force is an idea of fairness, and we tend to interpret fairness as meaning the same for everybody, which PISA doesn't have to worry about because it's a sample test and because it doesn't have those high stakes. But if you're the exam board looking to create that high stakes assessment, you need to arrive at a definition that you will then use for everybody. And as we heard from Mark yesterday, that is always going to be a sample of what creativity can be. It might even be a proxy for what creativity is, but it's not going to be direct. And so you've already got an issue and you're already having to limit what creativity is. I think there is a sort of solution to that, and the solution applies to all high stakes assessment in all areas actually, and that is you have to proceed through a cooperative venture with the educators and the stakeholders in your education system, having a discussion that gets them involved and somehow finding a way to come to a conclusion that says, yeah, we don't all like this, but we'll sign up to this as the definition that we're going to use and we're going to work with for the next while. And, let's have maybe a 5-year cycle and review in 5 years or whatever it may be. But you need to get everybody around the table, professionals and users and customers, if you like, the students and their parents of that assessment, of that qualification, say, okay, what are we going to define as creativity in our system in order to do this? And then you have to be willing to work with it, knowing that it's limited. So I think that's one issue. And the other one is the one about how you assess. And we've heard a couple of people sliding easily from the idea of external assessment straight into exams, as if those two things meant the same thing. And of course they don't need to mean the same thing. And also, if some of you attended Bill's session earlier, he had a list of various different methods of assessment, and there was one column, I can't remember what he's headed it up, but it was basically a variety of slightly more student-centred and flexible and active and possibly teacher-assessed methods of assessment. And he kind of tagged those as good for formative assessment, but not for summative. And thought, all of those methods of assessment can be used in summative, can be used in a high-stakes assessment. You can apply some kind of external standardisation because of that notion about fairness, about wanting some sort of consistency and so on. You just have to change your system's way of thinking, and that's the difficult bit, about what does make an assessment now reliable, maybe it's less reliable, consistent, maybe it's slightly less consistent, so maybe what you're looking for is a different set of values for what makes that an assessment a high quality assessment, a fit for purpose assessment, or a rigorous assessment. Maybe some of those assessment technical terms don't really apply, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Lena. I think it was really interesting what you were saying about changing the perspective that you have when you look at assessment and the values that the system has about assessment. And I heard a lot of people nodding in the room and the word fairness was mentioned, but that fairness that might not always necessarily mean everybody doing exactly the same thing. That maybe there might be other interpretations of that as well. And so I wanted to ask Anabela, when you're thinking about exams in Portugal, and especially building on that work with the profile of compulsory education and that big discussion that took place in Portugal to come together and think about what is the purpose of education in this space, how has that shaped maybe now how Portugal is thinking about exams and the potential for creativity in them?
I would say that we are doing it step by step. So one of the things that I consider that for the stage of development of Portugal education system, but also on the assessment system, is that a huge challenge is to work on the perceptions of the different factors in the education system. So we still struggle on one way, when we have low stakes assessments, to validate and work on the perceptions of the parents. That's the formative assessment, the more qualitative assessment on lower education is very important for you to see the progress. So you need to have a vision of the system to deliver a lot of information to the parents and to the teachers and to the schools so they can work on, adapt the strategies and progress in the difficulties of the students in the process of learning. So these assessments, the low stakes, are like less, I would say, people consider it's not as important. Students can skip it, may not attend it. It's not a problem. And it's the opposite for high stakes assessment. A national exam in Portugal is very serious stuff, if I can say it this way. So it's very serious. Students start preparation in the beginning of upper secondary education. They get very focused. Even when we go to some school, they were selected for exam. We are 15 years old, in the beginning of the 10th grade, and we say you were selected, and some of the students say, oh, no way, I'm not going to do it. Next year I will have a math exam, and I need to take this time to go to all the classes, and I cannot do this. And even the parents have this perception that for Portugal to keep going on the qualifications of the kids and promote them to enter university and get a high qualification is very important, because we were struggling until very recently to qualify our population. And we still do that for the adult population compared to the other countries or compared to the OECD average or the European average. We have a lot of people that don't have other secondary education like qualification. So we still value a lot, and we still value a lot the formal qualification and the formal assessment or exams. So what we try to do is let's show the community that it's possible to go a little bit on being creative and changing a little bit the way we are assessing on the low stakes. So in some of the assessments, we decided to go on a mixed way. So we have an assessment that assess history and geography. And then when I say that history and geography, there's items and tasks, therefore just for history, some of them just for geography, but other ones is like a mix of this. So it presents the students the task in a way that the students need to go to the two different areas of subject and decide which type of knowledge, content he needs to get, and articulate it in a way that is a little coherent and in a way perhaps a creative answer. The thing that we are not doing yet is also to define the criteria of these answers that the part, even if it's a small part, is related to was the student creative when presenting the answer. So we have a criteria that says, was the student able to articulate the two subjects, the two areas of content, and it was well succeeded on the answer, but we are not delivering any of these to the creativity. And I think that's the next step. So what we will try to do from this school year on is to work with some schools to invest in delivering them training on this specific area of assessing creativity, to help them also to raise and create very good instruments to work with the students. That is not only work as they do, but also to assess this work that is done. I think that's where our teachers need us to work with them, to help is to have an idea, I'm doing this for, and through the path of doing it with my classes and my students, how will I raise capacity to build up feedback that is current, that can be delivered to the students, and the student can understand and actually value the assessment that was done. So that's what we'll try to do. And the experience that I have in Portugal is, if you do it from the training, from teacher training, and if you do it in a massive way, or as massive as possible, and reaching a lot of teachers, actually you see some of the changes. We did that in the past for really, different from that. So I'm confident enough that we will be able to do this for creativity, and perhaps from other areas, because teachers are also want to innovate.
Absolutely. And I think what you've said, both about teachers, but also parents, I think really speaks to the role that exams and high stakes assessment can have in the national psyche, because it's such a big event that, for most people in their young lives, it's the first, massive big event like that you experience. And, to have change in the format, to have change in the way that it's delivered, the way that it's presented, probably requires generational change, because, if your parents experience it, they expect you to experience the same thing, and it can be quite hard to have that change occur. So what I want to ask now is about maybe some examples or some ways of delivering high stakes assessment that go beyond the exam format. And I think maybe you might have a couple up your sleeve of some different assessment methods that we know that countries are using, and in some cases have used for many years, because actually in many systems, the final grade that students get at the end of school doesn't just come from exams. It often comes from some sort of teacher-based assessment, from some form of classroom-based continuous assessment. And while that assessment might not be as high stakes, because it's not occurring on just one day, it's not a single event, there's still a high stakes attached to that, and there are still reasons for students to have pressure when they're doing those kinds of activities. So maybe, Lena, would you like to share maybe some examples that you've seen?
That kind of question of when does an assessment feel high stakes for the student, I think is an important one in all of this. And of course, let's not forget that there are educational systems that are not dominated by exams. Now, nearly all of them have some sort of an impact. I'm not sure if we managed to find any that had no exam at the end of secondary education, even the ones that are commonly sort of presented to us as though that system does not have exams, but it may still have a university entrance exam that only some people take. And therefore, and in some systems, in fact, even though it's like that, that still drives everything that happens. In others, it's open. But it's interesting that in those systems, there is research that suggests that the teacher grades are actually a better predictor of success at university than the standardised tests that might be administered, even though the kind of the rhetoric around that might be that the teacher grades are not reliable, or they're over generous, or they're constantly giving their pupils the benefit of the doubt, or even that they're biased. In general, those teacher grades do seem to be recognising something that is about that young person's potential that standardised tests can't. In other systems, of course, they're at the opposite extreme of that, and they cannot see the value of any assessment that can't be shown to be secure, reliable, consistently offered to everybody, and so on and so forth. So I just want to sort of talk a little bit about a system that in fact looks like that on the surface, and that's the system in England. I don't know if you're aware that the United Kingdom, for a very small country, has 4 completely separate education systems, and it's a bit mad in some ways. In my home country of Scotland, we think that our education system developed before the other 3, and therefore I think it's better. That may or may not be true. But I moved from the Scottish system to the English system in 2014, just at a point where there had been a number of controversies within the English system, and I was in the largest A-level and GCSE exam board in England. And the system then, the government, the policy makers, divested its senior school qualifications of all of the teacher assessment. There's a tiny bit left, but it's a tiny bit and only in a few subjects. I think there is still a little bit in some of the expressive arts subjects. But for example, they took practical assessment out of computing. Now, how can you possibly assess somebody's computing without actually assessing them doing it? So it's a system in which, over that past 10 or so years, there has been a retreat from innovative forms of assessment in the high stakes qualifications, a retreat from any kind of teacher-based or classroom-based form of assessment. And that appears to be the dominant culture that is there. You'll not be surprised to know that felt really quite alien and quite uncomfortable to me. And I stayed there for a while, but I was quite glad to leave it. Even there though, you can find some examples of good practice, whether they come from the bottom up or from the top down. And for example, there's a qualification called the Extended Project Qualification that all 3 of the big exam boards in England offer, where the student basically investigates anything that they want to investigate. They can produce their output in any form that they want to produce it usually. And that actually gained in popularity and in the number of students taking it after this move with the A-levels, the main school leaving qualification, because it was the only place for teachers and students to assess something a little bit more openly and to allow the students who were not doing the expressive arts, and in a 3-subject curriculum there's not much room for many students to do the expressive arts. It gave that room for them to express their own interests, to create something that felt more individual to them, and actually to be independent learners, because, learning lots of stuff for A-levels doesn't really make you an independent learner. Well, those qualifications have gained in popularity over the past 10 years, And universities, although they're not, strictly speaking, get you the points to get you in, but individual universities are now actually looking for students who have these. They are evaluating how well those students do at university, and they are finding that they're better prepared than the students who have just done the straight A levels. So even there's something going on that suggests we are keeping going with this, and there's something that we can do. That's quite an interesting qualification because it is actually externally assessed. The students do this very open project with a wide range of outputs, and they're sent to the exam board for some kind of marking, and everybody's quite happy with that. So that's something to think about. But the other place where we see something different in England, and it also was a kind of flagship government policy, was in the vocational qualifications. And the last government introduced something that they called T levels, which is meant to be a full-time vocational qualification for young people, equivalent to 3 A levels, so meant to allow you to enter higher education if you wanted to, but also to take a vocational route or to enter the workplace and so on. And there we can find that there are models, and they can be a bit more teacher assessed. The quality assurance of those, or the guarantor of credibility, comes from the involvement of employers. Not so much in the actual assessment process, but in having a bit of a say over what form the assessment takes or what kind of content it should take. And there you can see, for example, Pearson, who's another big exam board, have a T level in media, broadcast and production. Now that is obviously a creative industry, so it's within that sector, but it's a project that's set by employers. What the students have to do is to undertake some research, they have to generate some ideas, they have to communicate those to either the peers or somebody around or about them, they have to develop those ideas further, and then the next stage is they have to reflect on those ideas. And I think those kind of stages of creation, they're probably stages, if we all reflect, if we look at this, if we look at other frameworks. ACER has a critical and creative thinking skills framework in Australia. They all share these kind of features. There's something about finding things out, there's something about gathering that together, collating it, and then carrying out a process, and then there's something about reflecting how well we did it. That seems to be at the heart of a lot of creative skills framework, and that can be assessed through project type activities with a variety of different types of outputs, and can have some sort of external assurance on it. So I think what I would say is, even in a system like the English one, there are lessons there, and they're sitting in the vocational education sector, the general education sector could learn from that.
I think that, I really want to thank you for mentioning vocational education, because I think in spaces like this we often talk about the importance of developing creativity in a very general context and for students in general education. And as students get older and specialising and moving into vocational education, I think it's still really important that we think about how that can be a site for fostering creativity as well. And often actually there's a lot that we can learn from that space where, in technical education and technological design thinking, a lot of those processes already have a lot of creative thinking built into them. So in a moment we'll just open the floor maybe for some audience questions, but first before we do that, so I'll let you start thinking about the questions. Anabela, thinking about what Lena's mentioned and some of the different ways in which high stakes assessment can happen, are there any future innovations or possible ideas that you're thinking about in the context of Portugal, and what do you think the future could hold?
I think that we need to still working on two different levels. We need to work on the more policy level with ministries and people that make the decisions, to show that if we introduce also these skills, this type of skills as creativity, into the assessments or in the part of the assessments, even the high stakes, that goes from certification but also to enter the university in Portugal, we need to show them and actually give them some evidence that we will not be producing or presenting to the students less demanding assessments. Because that's a huge question in Portugal, where you try to innovate, even if it is in the curriculum manual or wherever it is in education, if you try to innovate, to foster some of these new skills or try to push teachers to present new different ways of teaching, people sometimes argue that we are lowering down how the educational level should be. We are going down the difficulty level, the demanding, what students need to know, and perhaps that's not good because we want to have excellence in all education systems. So, in one level, we need to do a huge effort to present evidence that this is feasible, this is also comparable, fair for our students, is even more perhaps engaged and will motivate students more. Of course, it will challenge teachers, but it will be also a very high quality assessment in this policy level. And at the same time, I think we should need to continue the work of consistently doing it in the lower secondary and then start doing in some subjects in the upper secondary, in the secondary exams. So it's like a mix. It's like having the practical and the good theoretical and the good exams, having evidence, and then present it to have decisions and compromise. Of course, we need also to start from this definition that is everyone accepted and everyone thinks and says, yeah, if I think about creativity in education and then in assessment, I would say this is very fair. This is a good definition. It's a part of what creativity is, but at least we know what we are going for. So, and at the same time, show that after having consensus, that is possible to be done in a very good quality level. Because we need to work on this and come back again to this idea of the perceptions. You could do a very good job in our office, but if the perceptions is not, when you present the assessment, is not as perceived as we want it, it doesn't matter if you explain that was a very good assessment or this was a very good exam or this is very fair. Because if people don't believe in it and don't receive it as well, as good, as important, and parents is a very key indicator on this. And the parents don't value this and think that it's not fair for the students to take an assessment like this. It doesn't matter if you have a lot of experts, if you are the best to do this. So,
thank you. I think what you just presented is a brilliant model for reform. You know, getting teachers on board, using all the levers, professional development, using the levers that sort of come to contact with parents, so that they can trust in the system. But also building up through the levels of education, and starting with those areas that are lower stakes, and then working up to the high stakes levels where often, you know, there's a wee bit more reluctance to make those changes. And that actually reminds me of what we've seen in Ireland recently, where they had quite big reforms at the junior cycle, which is when students are about 14, 15, and you're now learning from lessons from those reforms, they're implementing changes at the senior cycle. So I think that shows that maybe change can happen. It can happen slowly, maybe over 10, 15 years, you know, a generation at a time, but there's still scope for incorporating more creativity into high stakes assessments. So with that, we've got a little bit of time left, just a couple of minutes. So I was wondering if anybody here in the room today would like to ask any questions to our panelists, or if you would also like to share maybe an aspect from your own systems about how creativity is currently or isn't included in your high stakes assessments.
Thank you. That was a really great panel and beautifully facilitated as well, really nourishing discussion. I'm from dance as well, so really appreciate this perspective. So my first question is about the title, Creativity Under Pressure. Is pressure inherent in high stakes assessment? Can it ever be forced with that? And is the pressure productive. I would definitely argue it is. This is also the music corner over here. There may be others as well. It's the music corner. And I think one of the wonderful things about high stakes performance creative assessment is that the high stakes comes from so many different angles. It's just performing in a public realm, and students understand their work is going to be received by a variety of different audiences. They're getting formative feedback right there from their audience, whether it's laughs or claps or tears or any of those things. And is there a case for more of that transparency, or bring more of the parents of the community, into assessment to make it more visible? Of course, students tell us all the time that while they're performing for the audience, the one that counts is the assessor, but they still we're embedding this view that their work is going to be interpreted by a variety of different judges. Yeah, so I'd be interested in your view on that.
One thing that immediately springs to mind, and because I was thinking about some of the calls, like those from Bill Lucas, that some of you might have gone to his session. He, as well as his academic work, essentially is kind of spearheading a bit of a lobby group in England that was trying to change assessment. And one of the things that he said, particularly about creativity, but I think more generally, is that assessment should be as authentic as possible. And because that's one of the big criticisms of exams, that whoever sits down, with no materials and a set time frame and having to do a task in the real world, probably you don't have it in the real world. But if you are doing something creative, and not just actually in the arts creative, but if I'm as I was for many years, if I'm a policy manager in an exam board and I have to come up with a paper for a committee that's going to convince them to make this tiny change, but they think it's a massive change to an assessment, I'm having to be creative in how I write that paper and how I present that paper. And there is pressure in that. And there's pressure in coming up and putting your own ideas forward and presenting them in a way that is going to be accepted by others. And I wonder, and this is just a question, because I'm an assessment specialist, I'm not a creativity specialist. I spent a lot of time thinking about how you assess these broad skills that are across the curriculum. I wonder if creativity might be most valuable when it's shared with others. And therefore that aspect, which brings at least a little bit of pressure, is part of it, and that's just off the top of my head. And therefore that sharing with others in some way is part of what would make an authentic assessment. So maybe it would be good to completely remove the pressure. We don't want children like, Andreas showed in these graphs, was it Japan, I think, or Japan or Korea are the two countries where they have very high academic achievement and very, very low learner and emotional well-being. You don't want that.
I think that needs to be problematized quite deeply though. I understand you bring it up here, but I think, pointing to those examples as it places that as the problem, and I think there's heaps of experts from Japan who just say that's just not the case.
Yeah, okay, accept. Yeah, but that kind of sense of there can be a certain rhetoric that says we need to remove all this pressure from our senior assessment systems.
That's not skills based, that's not preparing people.
It doesn't prepare you for life or work.
A lot of pressure.
No,
Thank you for these comments. I think
We are on time.
we're just have a quick
Yeah.
word from Anabela.
Yeah, because I really like to point out an example related to the arts. So I brought the example of what we are doing in humanities, so history and geography, but we also do in all states. And I would say creativity is always under pressure when you talk about assessments. If you ask a teacher, they will say there's always under pressure. When about 10 years ago, there was presented to our office that we needed to have 2 performative assessments for the entire cohort population on the 2nd grade and 5th grade. One for artistic arts, which means music, expressions, and a lot more stuff. Another for physics education. Everyone in our office was like, no way. How come are you going to present something that is feasible for this entire cohort of students during the entire week? With actually a lot of teachers enrolled in the process of presenting the task, collecting the evidence, and giving us the feedback. No one would believe that we would be able to do it. And the most creativity people that work in our office are the teams on that 2 areas. And sadly, what we found from the assessment was these 2 areas, especially in the younger kids, became like very important. Like it's possible to also assess this, you know, because primary teachers especially have this idea that students are good at music or students are good at math, but they didn't have actually the evidence. So sometimes they struggle on giving the students some feedback for the parents. So in this assessment, this was possible. And I think that I will finish this using expression that I'm to use in Portugal, and I already hear it. So it seems like it's true. If you cannot do change in teaching inside the classroom from teaching changes, you go through the assessment. And because assessment is very regularly traced out and equal to all the teachers, sometimes you do the change through the assessment. So we several times try to do this, but you need to bring the teachers to this process as a partner. So.
Thank you very much. We're out of time now, but I wanted to thank both of our panelists, Lena and Anabela, and thank you all for